On April 17, 2026, the Indiana Fever announced a 4-year contract extension with Aliyah Boston valued at $6.3 million. The agreement made Boston the highest-paid player in WNBA history by total contract value and marked the first use of a financial mechanism introduced under the league's most recent collective bargaining agreement. To understand the full weight of what was signed that Friday, it is necessary to examine not just the headline figure, but the structure beneath it, the specific provisions that made this deal possible, the deliberate choices embedded in the numbers, and what this agreement signals for the broader economic direction of the league. The mechanism at the center of the deal is called the Exceptional Performance on Initial Contract provision, referred to in league circles as the EPIC provision. It was introduced as part of the new collective bargaining framework ratified in 2025, a landmark agreement that emerged from years of player advocacy and was accelerated by a dramatic shift in the league's commercial profile. The EPIC provision allows a player who has demonstrated elite performance during her rookie-scale contract to exit that contract early and renegotiate at a higher rate before her original deal expires. Boston became the first player in league history to execute this option. The significance of that distinction being first is not merely ceremonial. It means that every future player who navigates this provision will do so with Boston's contract as the reference point. The terms she accepted, the structure she agreed to, and the concessions she made will shape how teams present offers and how players evaluate them. Boston's deal is not just a personal financial milestone, it is, in practical terms, a template. To understand why the EPIC provision was necessary in the first place, it helps to look at where the league stood before the 2025 collective bargaining agreement. For most of the WNBA's existence, the rookie scale was rigid and conservative. Players entering the league on top draft picks earned salaries that were, by professional sports standards, modest to a degree that limited their financial security and often pushed them into overseas leagues during the American offseason. The structural gap between what players contributed to their franchises commercially and what they received in compensation was a recurring point of friction during labor negotiations. The 2025 season changed the calculus in ways that were difficult to ignore. Television ratings climbed sharply. Attendance figures in several markets reached historic levels. The Indiana Fever, in particular, became a focal point of national sports coverage, driven in large part by the presence of two players who had become genuine mainstream figures. Caitlin Clark, the former University of Iowa guard who entered the league with an unprecedented level of public attention, and Aliyah Boston, the former South Carolina center and the first overall pick in the 2023 draft. Their partnership on the court, one a perimeter playmaker with elite vision and shooting range, the other a skilled interior presence capable of defending, rebounding, and initiating offense from the high post, produced results that translated directly into franchise value. By the end of the 2025 regular season, Boston had been named to the All-WNBA second team and had established herself as one of the most complete big players in the league. She was not merely a complementary piece to Clark's game. She was the structural foundation that made Clark's game possible. The EPIC provision was triggered by that level of demonstrated performance, allowing the Fever to open extension talks before her rookie deal had run its course. The 4-year structure of the extension breaks down as follows. In the 2026 season, Boston will earn $1 million. From 2027 through 2029, her annual salary is tied to 20% of the league's salary cap, meaning her earnings will scale upward in proportion to the cap's growth. Given the trajectory established by the 2025 media rights deal, which brought significantly increased broadcast revenue into the league's financial structure, projections suggest the cap will continue to rise through the duration of Boston's contract. At 20%, her annual earnings in the final years of the deal are expected to surpass $1.5 million. The 2026 figure of $1 million is itself notable because it is not the maximum Boston was eligible to receive under the EPIC extension formula. Under the terms of the provision, she was eligible to earn approximately $1.19 million for the 2026 season. She accepted less. The difference, roughly $190,000, was a deliberate concession, not an oversight. The Fever's front office and Boston's representation structured the deal this way intentionally, and understanding why requires understanding how team building works under a hard salary cap. Professional basketball teams operating under a salary cap are in a constant negotiation between star salaries and roster depth. A franchise can invest heavily in one or two marquee players, but doing so compresses the available budget for the rest of the roster. The depth of a team, the quality of its rotational players, the experience on the bench, the versatility available to a head coach in critical moments often determines playoff outcomes more reliably than the ceiling of its best player. $190,000 in the context of a WNBA salary structure is not a trivial sum. It represents the kind of salary that attracts a reliable veteran with specific positional value, a perimeter defender who can guard multiple positions, a backup forward who does not require plays to be run for her but contributes meaningfully in shorter minutes. By accepting $1 million rather than the maximum eligible figure, Boston effectively preserved that budget space for the Fever's front office to use on roster construction. The decision reflects an understanding of team economics that goes beyond personal compensation. A player who earns the maximum possible salary, but watches her team fail to reach the postseason because the supporting cast was insufficient, has made a different kind of trade-off than a player who leaves a portion of her maximum on the table in exchange for a more competitive roster environment. Boston's calculation evidently fell on the latter side. This kind of structural decision-making has precedent in the NBA, particularly among players who have watched team-building strategies evolve in that league over the past 2 decades, but it is relatively new in the WNBA context. The league's salary scale was historically too compressed for these distinctions to carry much practical weight. When the gap between a maximum salary and a slightly below maximum salary was measured in tens of thousands of dollars rather than hundreds of thousands, the roster implications were limited. The new collective bargaining framework changed that dynamic by raising the ceiling high enough that the choices players make about their own compensation now have meaningful downstream effects on what their teams can construct around them. The broader implications of the cap percentage structure in the final 3 years of Boston's deal are worth examining separately. By tying her salary to a percentage of the cap rather than a fixed dollar figure, the Fever ensured that Boston's compensation would grow in proportion to the league's overall financial expansion. This protects her from the scenario in which the cap rises dramatically over the next 3 years, while she remains locked into a static salary that becomes, in relative terms, a diminishing share of what the league can support. It also creates a form of alignment between Boston's financial interests and the league's commercial health. When the WNBA generates more revenue, she earns more, automatically. The percentage-based structure also functions as a signal to the rest of the roster and to the broader player market. It communicates clearly where Boston sits in the Fever's organizational hierarchy. At 20% of the cap, her salary is not just a number, it is a benchmark against which other contracts on the roster are implicitly measured. Players negotiating with Indiana know what the top of the team's internal salary structure looks like, and they can assess their own value relative to that benchmark. This kind of transparency, whether intentional or structural, shapes the culture and self-understanding of a roster. The timing of the extension announcement also carries strategic significance. Indiana could have waited until Boston's rookie deal expired before negotiating a new contract. Teams in all professional leagues sometimes take that approach, either because they prefer to evaluate a player over a longer period before committing significant money, or because they want to preserve flexibility in the event that circumstances change. The Fever chose not to wait. By moving to secure Boston under a long-term deal before her existing contract ended, the franchise accomplished several things simultaneously. First, it eliminated uncertainty on both sides. Boston knows her financial situation through 2029. The Fever know their cap commitments and can plan accordingly. That mutual certainty has organizational value independent of the specific dollar amounts involved. Second, it sent a message to the player market. Every free agent considering her next contract destination, every veteran player evaluating whether to seek a trade or test the open market, now has evidence that the Indiana Fever are an organization willing to invest in their core at historic levels. Franchises that treat their star players generously tend to attract additional talent. Those with a reputation for difficult negotiations or reluctant investment tend to find free agency more challenging. The Fever, by breaking the record for the richest contract in league history, made themselves a more attractive landing spot for players at every level of the salary scale. Third, it positioned the franchise favorably for what is expected to be the most consequential contract negotiation in league history: Caitlin Clark's extension. Clark, who entered the league on a rookie-scale contract like Boston, is approaching the point in her career where her own extension negotiation will become the central financial story of the WNBA. The broad outlines of what that negotiation will look like are not yet determined, but the context in which it will occur has now been shaped by what Boston agreed to. If the two players are understood as the co-anchors of Indiana's franchise, and if Boston set her salary at 20% of the cap, then Clark's negotiation will necessarily be conducted in reference to that figure. Whether she accepts the same percentage, negotiates for more, or structures her deal differently, Boston's contract is now the established data point. The relationship between these two players' contracts is not merely arithmetic. It reflects a philosophical question about how franchises value different kinds of contribution. Boston's game is built on defense, rebounding, screening, and playmaking from the interior. These are contributions that show up in the box score, but are often more legible to coaches and analysts than to casual observers. Clark's game is built on scoring, shooting range, and the kind of creative passing that generates enormous public excitement and media coverage. The two players contribute in ways that are complementary but not equivalent in their commercial impact. How the Fever choose to reflect that in their respective salary structures, if they structure them differently at all, will be one of the more revealing organizational decisions of the next 2 years. The WNBA's shift toward higher salaries does not exist in isolation from broader changes in women's professional sports. Across several leagues and sports, the period from roughly 2023 through 2026 has been marked by accelerating commercial growth, driven by a combination of expanded media rights deals, increased corporate sponsorship, and a generational audience shift toward women's athletics. The WNBA was a particular beneficiary of this trend, in part because its existing infrastructure, arenas, travel arrangements, league organization was mature enough to absorb growth quickly, and in part because the arrival of several players with crossover appeal happened to coincide with the league's commercial inflection point. The salary consequences of that growth are still working their way through the system. The collective bargaining agreement ratified in 2025 represented a significant step toward closing the gap between what the league generates and what players receive. But that agreement was negotiated at a specific moment in time using financial projections that are already being outpaced by actual revenue growth in some markets. The EPIC provision was designed in part to address this mismatch, to give players a mechanism for accelerating their compensation in the event that their individual performance and commercial contribution significantly exceeded what the rookie scale anticipated. Boston's use of the provision demonstrates that it functions as intended. A player who entered the league earning a fraction of what her market value would suggest, whose franchise became demonstrably more valuable in direct correlation with her performance, was able to exit her initial contract early and negotiate compensation that more accurately reflects her worth. Whether the league will see more players use the EPIC provision in coming seasons, and whether future negotiations will produce similar structures or different ones, remains to be seen. But the provision has now been tested, and the test produced a result that the league can point to as a successful application of the new framework. The position that Boston plays, center, or in modern parlance, the versatile interior player who can function both near the basket and away from it, has undergone a revaluation in the analytics-informed era of professional basketball. For a period in both the NBA and WNBA, the rise of three-point shooting as the dominant offensive efficiency metric created a perception that traditional post players were declining in value. Teams that built around perimeter shooting and ball movement could generate efficient offense without requiring an elite interior scorer, which led some analysts and front offices to downgrade the importance of the center position. The reality, as teams discovered through experience, is more complicated. A perimeter-oriented offense creates specific vulnerabilities, particularly on the defensive end, where teams without a reliable rim protector struggle against opponents who attack the basket, and on the offensive glass, where guards and wings are structurally disadvantaged against taller opponents. More subtly, a perimeter offense without an interior anchor is susceptible to defensive adjustments that crowd the three-point line and force the ball inside, where there may be no one capable of finishing effectively. Boston addresses all of these vulnerabilities for the Fever. Her presence in the paint forces opposing defenses to account for her as a threat, which affects how they can deploy defenders against Clark on the perimeter. When Clark has the ball on the wing, a defense that collapses to prevent a drive must leave Boston in a position to receive a pass and score or create, When the defense extends to challenge Clark's shooting, Boston has interior space to operate. The two players create a geometric problem for opposing coaches that neither could create as effectively without the other. Paying Boston 20% of the cap is in part paying for the value she adds to Clark's effectiveness, a form of compensation that does not appear in Boston's individual statistics but is visible in the team's offensive efficiency numbers. Looking at where the WNBA stands as an institution at this moment, the Boston contract is a useful data point for several intersecting questions about the league's future. The competitive landscape is changing. Teams that built dynasty-level rosters under the previous salary structure, the Las Vegas Aces, who won consecutive championships in 2022 and 2023, and the New York Liberty, who emerged as a consistent contender, now face a league in which the financial tools available to franchises have expanded significantly. The epic provision and the broader salary increases in the new collective bargaining agreement mean that the teams with the best young players and the organizational sophistication to maximize the new financial mechanisms may hold structural advantages that were not available under previous rules. Indiana, by moving early and decisively to lock in their core under the new framework, has positioned itself at the front of that transition. Whether other franchises follow with similar contract structures or develop different approaches that prove equally or more effective will define the competitive shape of the league for the next several years. The broader significance of the deal extends beyond any specific team or player. A professional basketball player in the United States Domestic Women's League has signed a contract worth $6.3 million over 4 years, and done so in a context where the conversation is not about whether she deserves that amount, but about the strategic implications of the specific structure she chose. That is a different kind of conversation than the one being held about WNBA salaries even 3 years ago. The terms of public and professional discourse around these contracts, what questions are asked, what comparisons are made, what is treated as newsworthy, reflect the underlying reality of where the league stands commercially and institutionally. The Indiana Fever's decision to execute this contract, and Boston's decision to accept the specific terms she accepted, represents a particular vision of how a franchise builds towards sustained success. It is a vision built on financial transparency, long-term planning, roster construction philosophy, and a recognition that the individual decisions of star players about their own compensation have consequences for everyone around them. Whether that vision produces championships will be answered on the court over the next 4 years. What can be said now is that the vision has been executed with an unusual degree of deliberateness, and that it has produced the most expensive contract in WNBA history as a byproduct of that deliberateness rather than as an end in itself. The era of the million-dollar contract in the WNBA has arrived. What follows, how teams adapt, how players negotiate, how the league's financial architecture continues to evolve, will determine whether this moment is remembered as a threshold crossed or a foundation built. The evidence from Indianapolis suggests the people most directly involved are thinking in terms of the latter. The question that now hangs over the rest of the league is not whether other franchises will attempt to replicate what Indiana has built, but whether they have the organizational capacity to do so. Building a roster around 2 franchise-level players under a hard salary cap requires more than financial resources. It requires front office personnel capable of identifying which supporting players provide the highest marginal value at a given salary level, coaching staff capable of integrating those players into a coherent system quickly, and ownership willing to invest in the infrastructure, training facilities, medical staff, player development programs that keeps core players healthy and improving over a multi-year window. The Fever appear to have assembled those components. Whether their competitors can match that assembly is a separate question from whether they can match the contract figures. The Las Vegas Aces present the most instructive comparison. Their back-to-back championship roster was constructed under the previous collective bargaining framework, and the salary structure that held that group together has since been disrupted by the new agreement's higher ceilings and expanded player options. Several of the veteran players who contributed to those championships are now operating in a market where their services command prices that may strain the Aces' ability to retain the depth that made them so difficult to defeat in a playoff series. The new framework did not create this problem for Las Vegas specifically, but it accelerated the timeline on which roster decisions must be made. Teams that were planning on another 1 or 2 years of continuity before facing significant roster turnover have found that timeline compressed. The New York Liberty face a different version of the same challenge. Their roster was constructed around a core of experienced players with established complementary roles, and the chemistry produced by that continuity was a significant factor in their competitiveness. Replicating that chemistry after the financial disruption created by the new salary structure requires either retaining the existing core at prices the new framework makes possible but expensive, or identifying replacement players capable of fitting the same roles at a lower cost. Neither path is straightforward, and both carry risks that the Liberty's front office is currently navigating. What Indiana has done, in structural terms, is bypass that specific problem by locking in their core before the disruption fully propagated through the league. Boston's contract, executed now rather than after her rookie deal expired, establishes certainty at the center of the roster before the broader market for players at her position becomes more competitive and more expensive. The Fever are not immune to the pressures facing other franchises, but they have reduced their exposure to one of the most significant variables, the cost of retaining a foundational player, by resolving it early and on terms that both sides found acceptable. There is also a generational dimension to this moment that deserves direct acknowledgement. The players who are now signing contracts in the $1 million range entered the sport at a time when professional basketball in the American Women's League was not, for most players, a financially sustainable long-term career without supplementary income from overseas play. The decision to spend winters in Turkey, Russia, or China was not a choice driven primarily by a desire for additional competition. It was a financial necessity for many players who could not support themselves on WNBA salaries alone. The health consequences of that schedule, the compressed recovery time, the accumulated physical wear from playing 12 months a year, have been a documented concern within the sport for years. The salary increases now working their way through the league do not eliminate that calculus overnight for every player on every roster, but at the level of the highest earners, they begin to change it. A player earning $1.5 million annually from her domestic contract is in a materially different financial position than a player earning $500,000 and supplementing that income abroad. Whether the league can extend those gains further down the salary scale, to the veterans earning league minimum or near minimum, to the players who make rosters but do not anchor them, remains the unresolved challenge at the center of the ongoing labor relationship between players and ownership. Boston's contract does not solve that challenge, but it moves the visible ceiling of what the league compensates its players, and in doing so, it shifts the reference point against which all other salary conversations will now be conducted. When the next round of collective bargaining arrives, the argument for further salary increases at every level of the scale will be made in part by pointing to what the league's most prominent franchises have already demonstrated they are capable of paying. The foundation being laid in Indianapolis in April 2026 is not only about the Indiana Fever's championship prospects, it is about what professional women's basketball in the United States is prepared to become.